Well, right now, Russia is weighing in on any possible UN actions against Syria for its chemical weapons use, insisting that any new resolutions do not include the threat of military force. Russia's foreign minister did say, however, that the use of force could be considered if Syria violates the deal on abandoning its chemical weapons. So that's happening now. In the meantime, the Wall Street Journal is taking a close look at how the president handled the crisis in Syria, publishing an in-depth investigative piece after dozens of interviews of White House and Defense Department officials and their counterparts overseas, examining what exactly happened behind closed doors over the last 3 weeks. The authors of the story basically summed it up like this, saying, quote, "Through mixed messages, miscalculations, and an 11th hour break, the U.S. stumbled into an international crisis and then stumbled out of it. A president who made a goal of reducing the U.S.'s role as global cop lurched from the brink of launching strikes to seeking congressional approval to embracing a deal with his biggest international adversary on Syria, Russian President Vladimir Putin." Our next guest was one of the reporters who wrote that journal story. Her name is Carol Lee. She joins us now. As far as we know, Carol, we share the same last name. We're not related. But we'll look into that. And with your investigative journalism skills, I'm sure we'll be able to figure it out. But your piece was really fascinating. You talk about the details from what lawmakers were eating when they got the call from the White House that the president was going to seek congressional approval, to some of the more in-depth conversations between high-ranking officials. And one of the things that you write is the event shed light on what could prove a pivotal moment for America's role in the world. What is the big takeaway for our viewers about how this all went down?
Well, the big takeaway is that this was a big accident in many ways. The piece that we wrote looks at August 21st, which was the day of the chemical weapons attack, until this past weekend, and just how much the White House and the president were switching, and there were all kinds of twists and turns in terms of what direction they were going to move in to respond to this. You know, at first that it was downplayed a little bit. A couple days later, the president had a meeting in the Situation Room where he said to his senior advisors that this is what he was talking about when he set the red line a year ago, in saying that if Syria's President Bashar al-Assad had used chemical weapons, then he would be forced to take action. And then we saw a real drumbeat of war going on for the next about week or so. And the military was prepared to launch strikes. They thought they were going to get the order. The White House sent out Secretary of State John Kerry to make a closing argument on a Friday.
So what changed all that? What was the big change?
The big change was that then the president was told by Martin Dempsey, the chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, that he could hold off on launching strikes. And the other thing was, a big pivotal moment was when the U.S. watched the vote in the British Parliament go down, and President Obama had thought that Prime Minister David Cameron was going to be an ally for him on this, and they spoke, and the British were telling the White House that they had the votes, and then they didn't. And the White House really underestimated the level of public, how much the public was against moving into Syria and striking Syria. And so that really set them, made them sit up straight. And the president went on a walk with his chief of staff on a Friday night around the White House lawn and basically laid out what his thinking was on this. And
if I could jump in there, Carol, because we've heard the story of him walking with Dennis McDonough on the White House lawn, that he makes a speech the next day. And your article points out that Susan Rice and Chuck Hagel were really against the president going to Congress because of his credibility. The president has come out recently in interviews, and you've also quoted him as he talked to senior staff in a closed-door meeting, saying, I'm not interested in style points, I'm interested in results. But a big question that's come from our viewers is, who is leading in all of this, and is there a clear plan and objective when it comes to Syria?
Well, the White House has not done a very good job of, frankly, of communicating what its Syria policy is, and this president has been very reluctant to get involved.
Do they know, Carol? Does it seem like they have a firm policy, or is that policy being made up in these different steps as they go along?
Well, ultimately, the way that this whole situation turned out in terms of the use of chemical weapons, appealed to their overarching policy in Syria, which many people have criticized as confusing. But what the White House has tried to do is separate this particular chemical weapons incident from their overarching Syria policy, which is that there is not a military solution to solving the conflict in Syria, and that there needs to be a political resolution, and they really need Russia on that. And on a separate track, at least they've tried to keep these things on a separate track, and although they've been meshed together, and frankly, the president's critics say he hasn't done a good job of explaining what his intentions are here. But what they tried to do was keep this chemical weapons attack separate and deal with that, and the president was willing to go in militarily. He got a last-minute save by a misspoken, an unplanned comment by Secretary John Kerry that tipped off a diplomatic track that the White House had, just days before said all diplomatic tracks had been exhausted. And so that also, and the diplomatic track also appealed to the president's, natural inclination, which is to not jump into a military solution.
Right.
And at the same time, he was going to lose the vote in Congress, and so it saved a lot of political face for him.
And that's a big question of whether or not you could separate the chemical attack with the general policy, and how this leadership style could potentially impact the agenda in Congress. Those are some big questions moving forward. Carol, thank you so much for the time today.
Sure,
we appreciate it.
Thank you.